The human mind can reach such heights of inspiration, depths of feeling, and subtleties of understanding that many people believe it can't be only a physical organism. But modern science says that everything can be explained in terms of matter and energy, and somehow all mental activity must be produced by the physical brain. This is the basis for the mind-body problem, a conflict as perplexing as any in modern philosophy. The philosopher who most focused attention on the mind-body problem was René Descartes. Born in France in 1596, Descartes was a leader in the new science of his era, later called the Scientific Revolution. He invented analytic geometry, and following the lead of Galileo, tried to set the physical sciences on a firm foundation of mathematical laws. Descartes is a perfect example of the philosopher as a solitary thinker. Although French, he chose to live most of his life in Holland, where religious tolerance allowed him to work in peace. He would often stay in bed for most of the morning, pursuing ideas.
He writes his meditations, he says, when he has no passions and no jobs, utterly, he says, with no involvements and no concerns, and then he can think philosophy and really get it right about reality.
In Descartes' era, skepticism, or casting doubt on everything, was fashionable. In one famous meditation, Descartes posed every skeptical argument he could against the possibility of knowing anything for certain. Then he concluded that there was one thing he could know beyond any doubt.
I noticed that whilst I thus wished to think all things false, it was absolutely essential that the I who thought this should be somewhat. And remarking that this truth, I think, therefore I am, was so certain and so assured that all the most extravagant suppositions brought forward by the skeptics were incapable of shaking it. I came to the conclusion that I could receive it without scruple as the first principle of the philosophy for which I was seeking.
Many would contend that mental experience is not as certain as Descartes believed, but for others, his argument rings true.
We have more confidence in the reality of our own conscious experiences than we have in the external world, than experiences in others, than in distant stars and galaxies, and so on. We know about this more certainly than we know about anything else. This was one of Descartes' points. I think this is one of Descartes' points which has not been overturned.
What looks like the very attractive call of Descartes to us is set aside all appeal to authority, all appeal to what comes from outside. Don't take it on somebody's word. Check it out. Check it out yourself.
How then would Descartes address the mind-body problem? Reflecting further on his thinking self,
I saw that I could conceive that I had no body, and that there was no world nor place where I might be. But yet that I could not for all that conceive that I was not. From that, I knew that I was a substance, the whole essence or nature of which is to think, and that for its existence there is no need of any place, nor does it depend on any material thing.
Descartes saw this same distinction between mind and body reflected in all of nature. In 17th century philosophy, a substance was regarded as something that didn't depend on anything else for its existence. Descartes maintained that the entire universe consists of two substances: matter, which exists in space, and mind, which has no spatial or physical properties and exists only in God and human minds. The doctrine became known as Cartesian dualism.
Cartesian dualism is a view that, as I see it, has very little chance of being true. It is a sort of an empty place waiting for someone to put a theory there. We'd like, for example, to be told just what is this mind stuff made of? What are its elements? What are its structural and dynamical properties? How does it behave over time? These are things that Descartes never gave us, nor any of Descartes' followers ever gave us.
Perhaps the hardest question for Cartesian dualism to answer is this: if mind and body are separate and distinct substances, how can they interact? How can something outside the material world reach in and affect something in the material world without breaking basic laws of physics?
There are some well-known physical laws, let's call them well-established physical laws, called the first law of thermodynamics, which says that energy is neither created nor destroyed, and the law of conservation of momentum, which says that the total momentum in any closed physical system is always a constant.
If we're going to have a law of conservation of energy, but we're going to have the mental separate from the physical, isn't this law of conservation of energy of the physical world going to be violated by having the mind poking around in there and moving things? Descartes recognized that, and Descartes had a theory that if the mind somehow wigwagging a useless gland in the brain called the pineal gland, which actually, according to modern paleontology, is a residue of a prehistoric third eye in the top of the head. No use for it was known in Descartes' day, much less its origin.
The soul has its principal seat in this little gland which exists in the middle of the brain. The machine of the body is so formed that from the simple fact that this gland is diversely moved by the soul, or by such other cause, whatever it is, it thrusts the spirits which surround it towards the pores of the brain, which conduct them by the nerves into the muscles, by which means it causes them to move the limbs.
So he thought, lack of anything better, that would be his explanation of how mind worked on body.
But if there is even the slightest change in either the energy or the momentum of even the tiniest particle in your brain that isn't already explained by its energy exchange with some other purely physical particle, then what you've got is a flat violation of one or both of these two fundamental laws of nature.
Few people have accepted Descartes' theory of the pineal gland, but his dualism did have an appeal for more basic reasons.
Even philosophers who don't agree with Descartes' dualism, and that would be the majority of philosophers today, still wrestle with it because there is something rather right about the idea that in addition to my body, I have a mind which is not physical.
Some interpreters of Descartes have seen his dualism as an attempt to keep peace between the new science and the church. It allowed science to explore and explain the physical world, and the church to maintain its authority over the world of souls. But many advocates of the new science objected to the idea of mind as a non-physical substance. Why not go the other way and suppose that everything in the universe is matter? Then figure out how to account for mind in terms of matter. This position is known as materialism. The most outspoken materialist in Descartes' era was the British philosopher Thomas Hobbes. For Hobbes, the universe consisted of matter in motion, nothing else. Asked to comment on Descartes' notion of mind, Hobbes wrote,
"We can conceive of no activity whatsoever apart from its subject. We cannot think of leaping apart from that which leaps, of knowing apart from a knower, or of thinking without a thinker, and hence it seems to follow that that which thinks is something corporeal."
But if dualism struggles to account for how mind and body can interact, materialism struggles to account for everything that seems to happen only in the mind.
One of the challenges that Hobbes faces in giving a materialistic account of human emotions is to explain how feelings such as love, joy, hatred, fear can be material. And what he says is that they are endeavors by which he means the first beginnings of motion. They are motions on a small scale, as it were. So when I experience the emotion of fear, let's say of a spider, what's happening in me is that there are certain incipient motions which would typically lead me to run away from the object that I fear.
For centuries, neither Cartesian dualism nor materialism was backed up by much scientific evidence. But in the 20th century, serious efforts to develop a science of psychology began. Many felt the key to this effort would be to translate thoughts and feelings into objective units that scientists could observe. One advocate of this approach, the British philosopher Gilbert Ryle, wrote a famous put-down of Cartesian dualism. He called Descartes' notion of a mind that comes from outside to move the body the ghost in the machine.
Ryle said that instead of talking about the states and processes occurring in a sort of ghostly medium in the mind, we should think about the competences of a human body, really. Since he was not a scientist, he didn't spell this out at all. He waved this off. He talked about dispositions, and in particular about multi-track dispositions to behave in various ways.
Ryle asked, for instance, how a child could learn what the word pain means if pains are only in the mind. The fact that children can learn the meaning of words for mental states suggests that those states are somehow observable. Ryle's closest scientific associates, psychological behaviorists, argued that everything we call a mental state is actually a behavior or disposition to behavior.
I'm sure not very many philosophers defend it anymore, if any, but it was claimed at one time that statements about mentality, of psychological statements, including ordinary language psychological statements, Joe thinks such and such, Molly wants such and such, and so on. It was claimed that all of these statements could be translated without residue into statements about actual and possible behavior.
But now the question is, how do you do it? How do you give a materialist account of pain, for example? Well, the behaviorist said it's all just behavior. It's your actual and possible behavior. So to be in pain is just to cry out or be disposed to cry out or whatever. It's a silly view, but that you can see how people would get desperate and they'd say that. Or if I believe it's going to rain, then that can only be, then my belief has to be constituted by the fact that I'll carry an umbrella, for example. Now, there are lots of problems with behaviorism. The most obvious problem is it just seems to leave out the mind. I mean, as somebody once said, it seems like you have to feign anesthesia. You got to pretend to be anesthetized if you're going to be a behaviorist.
Various other theories attempted to explain how thoughts and feelings might be connected to the physical brain, without success. But hope soared in the mid-20th century with the emergence of a new technology. Suddenly, machines were processing vast amounts of information and performing complex computations. Enthusiasts predicted that soon computers would be able to do everything minds can. Then it would become clear that the brain is just a computer and the mind a computer program. Matter produces mind. Materialism is correct. And soon we'll figure out the details. In 1951, computer pioneer Alan Turing proposed a simple test for judging when a computer had reached the level of a human mind. Talk with it. Type questions. Have both humans and computers type back answers. And when a computer can cause humans to think it's human, then it will have equaled a human mind. Many philosophers have presented arguments against the Turing test. One of the most famous comes from John Searle.
If the idea is, well, the computer has mental capacities just in virtue of implementing the program and passing the Turing test, you can refute that in 2 minutes. And the refutation is just imagine that I am the computer and let it be for some capacity that I don't in fact have. and I'm locked in a room with a bunch of Chinese boxes full of Chinese symbols, and I have a rule book, that's the computer program, for manipulating these symbols, and they pass me questions in Chinese, and I look up what I'm supposed to do in the book, and I give them back symbols, also in Chinese. And after a while, we suppose I get so good at manipulating the symbols, and they get so good at writing the program, that I pass the Turing test. My answers are indistinguishable from native Chinese speakers. All the same, I don't speak a word of Chinese, and I don't understand any Chinese. Now, what does this show? Well, the bottom line is, if I don't understand Chinese on the basis of implementing the Chinese language understanding program, then neither does any other digital computer solely on that basis, because no computer has anything I don't have. So the distinction between the computer and the mind is that the computer just manipulates formal symbols, syntax, syntactical objects, whereas mind has something in addition to symbols. It's got meanings. That's not a weakness of the computer. That's why we use computers. You can forget about the meanings and just go with the syntax, just go with the meaningless symbols. But if you're talking about human minds, the essential thing about the mind is it doesn't just have formal symbols, it's got mental contents.
Supporters of the Turing test argued that while the person in the Chinese room couldn't understand Chinese, the whole setup of room, program, boxes, and person could. In fact, any computer able to pass the Turing test would have to be tremendously powerful, not like the hapless fellow pictured by Searle. But hopes that computers would quickly catch up with the mind ran into other problems. In his 1972 book, What Computers Still Can't Do, Hubert Dreyfus pointed out some capacities of the mind that computers are failing to match. One was a sense of relevance.
Even if you stored all the facts that you could about the world, and as a bunch of facts, you wouldn't be able to get out the relevant ones when you wanted it. We have a capacity, amazing capacity, of just bringing out the relevant information. I used as an example, if we were betting on a horse race and we knew that the jockey had hay fever, and we saw that the field was full of blooming goldenrod, we would know right away, don't bet on that horse ridden by that jockey.
Another distinct capacity of the mind is common sense.
Just getting all the information into a system that only has in it facts misses the huge amount of stuff we know, not as facts, but just as ways of doing things. I once saw a cartoon which was directions for using a doorknob, and it was saying, get to the door, place yourself 3 or 4 inches from the door, face the door, put your right hand over on this doorknob, rotate it, and so forth. I mean, the amount of instructions you would need just for going through a door would be immense, and probably wouldn't work either if there was any sort of breakdown, like something in the way or something.
What Bert was saying at the time, and he turned out to have been right, was that, gentlemen, you're going to run into certain kinds of problems here because you're ignoring these kinds of phenomena that are already visible in human cognition. And in the event, after 10 years, 15 years, 20 years went by, the kinds of abilities that Bert pointed to, the ability to recognize faces, the ability to make a ham sandwich, the ability to get dressed in the morning, these turned out to be just the sorts of things that it was exceedingly difficult to get computers to do at all.
The failure of computers to match the human mind spurred researchers in artificial intelligence and neuroscience to look more closely at the differences between computers and brains.
What typical computers do, the machines on your desktop, serial digital machines, is spread the computational load over time. They can afford to do that because they function very, very fast. The speed of information transmission inside a computer is essentially the speed of light. They can do things very fast in time. The brain can't do that. The brain is very, very slow. What the brain does is distribute the computational load, not over time, but over space, over millions and millions, billions of neurons spread over the surface of your brain, and it processes the information that they contain all at once in a million little different places.
Brains are millions of channels wide. They're all operating at the same time, and they're not running synchronously. They are running sort of out of phase with each other and sometimes in phase with each other, sometimes holding hands, sometimes relaxing. They are parallel processors. The effect is, if you had all the home computers in the world running at the same time and occasionally passing simple messages back and forth, that would be more or less the architecture of a single human brain, although much simpler than a single human brain. Human brains are really just staggeringly complex structures.
Presented with such staggeringly complex structures, people on both sides of the argument recognize we need to learn more about artificial intelligence and neuroscience before we can draw any firm conclusions. Materialists argue that the mystery of the mind is an illusion that science will clear up.
Science has gained deep and penetrating accounts of things that are familiar in our everyday life, and they've gained explanatory purchase on them by identifying them with an underlying reality, with molecules, with molecular motion, with electromagnetic waves, with flowing electrons, and so forth. This is what has made modern science so successful as it is, technologically speaking. We hope for the same thing where the mind is concerned. We think that, we're inclined to believe that. We think the evidence suggests that we will understand mental phenomena better when we appreciate what their underlying neurophysiological nature is, their neurofunctional, their neurochemical, their neuropharmacological nature. And when we understand these things and look back on the old concepts, it will be like looking back on the flat earth. We'll wonder how we ever stood it.
Other philosophers doubt whether we will ever be able to reduce all mental phenomena to physical terms.
Even in science, really, reduction is a pretty rare thing, you know, where a property at one science can really be defined in using the concepts of a lower level science. I mean, there's only, the reason we use the example of light is electromagnetic radiation over and over and over again is it's almost the only clean example.
Let me, I think, can see right off why this reductive kind of project is a dead-end project. It looks exciting sometimes scientifically, because after all, what our modern science aims at is precise explanation and prediction. So it looks exciting from that point of view, but it looks exciting only at the expense of leaving out all that's really interesting to explain. It never ends up explaining because what's really interesting to explain gets lost.
So neuroscience is certainly doing a better and better job of explaining the functions, how it is that we discriminate and integrate and control our behavior. But explaining those functions better and better and better doesn't do anything to remove the further problem of explaining subjective experience.
So you were reminded of remember the cautionary story of the drunk looking for his keys at night under the lamppost, and somebody finally asked him, well, did you drop them here? And he said, no, I dropped them way over there, but there's so much more light here, right? So you, in a sense, you lose sight of what you're trying to explain, what you're trying to examine, because a certain way of proceeding casts so much light on whatever it's casting light on, but it isn't casting light on what you really want to know, which is how human beings operate, how they are selves, what it is to be a self.
Accounts of what it's like to be human most often center on the experience of consciousness. The subjective, first-person nature of conscious experience resists being explained in objective, third-person terms.
When I look out at the world, there's a bunch of objective things going on in my brain. But what's truly interesting is what happens subjectively. I look out at that red apple, and I have an image of a red apple in my mind's eye. It feels like something. I have that ineffable quality of redness, as I have a subjective experience. And one's consciousness consists of a whole array of those conscious experiences. In vision, in hearing, one hears a bunch of sounds, the sound of a middle C in the distance, maybe the feeling of warmth and coldness, a stream of conscious thought running through one's head, maybe a little sparkle of happiness, or the weight somehow of despair, all these subjective feelings which kind of together constitute the contents of one's consciousness.
Materialists respond by comparing minds to illusions, like sunrises. Through the ages, people were convinced that the sun rose each morning. But once science came to understand the actual motions of Earth and sun, it became clear that the sun only appears to rise. For materialists, consciousness, mind, and soul are similar appearances. We will see through them as soon as we understand how the brain actually works.
In the history of human thought, whenever there's been something that's mysterious, we've sort of pumped a little guy in there, a poltergeist or homunculus, and said, that explains it. Of course, it doesn't explain anything. The whole trick to explaining any of these phenomena is to get that little guy out of there.
But within the notion of reduction, you need to distinguish between those reductions that get rid of a phenomenon by showing that it was really something else, that it really wasn't there at all, like sunsets. Sunsets weren't there. It's an illusion created by the rotation of the Earth on its axis. But there's another kind of reduction where you just explain something. And I'm saying you can explain consciousness. I don't see any problem about explaining it, but you don't eliminate it.
For most people, I think the idea that plants have souls, or that plants have minds, or that, say, simple organisms have minds, we can sort of see how they're just a lot of really fancy machinery. The one we're really resistant to is our own soul. The idea that that I am just all this machinery, that what I am is a point of view enabled by all of this machinery. But that's what I am.
And here's the bottom line of this discussion. The basic point is, you can't do an eliminative reduction on something that really exists. And consciousness really exists.
The fact that there's a body that has that point of view is all there is to being conscious.
Few philosophers today adhere to a Cartesian dualist position that mind is separate from matter. But not many either hold that people are only bodies with points of view. When you look deep inside, what do you see? A soul? A mind? Or signals from a remarkably complex, organic machine? The Examined Life is a 26-part series for college credit. To purchase a video cassette or transcript of this program, call 626-796-7300 or visit us online. Please order by program number.